Hello, Fall Contracts Class of 2025. My name's Aaliyah Armstrong. Thank you so much for attending a small review on contracts. Today, we will be going over 3 points. Number 1, we'll do an overview of contracts and a proposed essay approach. And then we will review a couple more intricate points on contracts involving the sale of both goods and non-goods. And we'll go over merchants versus non-merchants. So, firstly, I want to do full disclosure. What your professor says goes for their class. So if anything I say is different from what your professor is saying, go with what the professor says. This is just an approach that I got, but obviously whatever your professor says is better. So here we can see one approach we can take for contracts is there will be 4 points. First, you'll start with choice of law, UCC or common law. Then you'll move into creation, offer acceptance and consideration. Then you'll go into defenses. And finally, you'll go into remedies. So, first of all, what is a contract? A contract is a promise or a set of promises, the breach of which, for which the law offers remedies, or the performance of which the law views as a duty. So how can we determine whether a contract is governed under common law or UCC? If it is under goods, as you guys know, that contract will be governed by UCC. And everything else is governed by common law. And at the creation of a contract, there must be an offer, acceptance, and consideration, as you know. Then in your essay, you will be moving on to defenses. And if no defenses apply, then you have a valid contract. And so the promises will have remedies for the breach of that contract. And the performance of that contract will be viewed as a duty at law. So there are remedies for the breach of that contract, which in your essay there will be likely be a breach, and then you can talk about the remedies for that breach. So some of the remedies for breach of contract can be monetary or non-monetary, restitution, rescission, and reformation. Also, some of the defenses that you can talk about is illegality, statute of frauds, unconscionability, breach. And then you can talk about under breach, whether it's common law or UCC. So under common law, you will discuss whether the breach is material or not, whereas in UCC, the perfect tender rule governs. And there's an exception for the perfect tender rule. An exception for the perfect tender rule is if there is a counteroffer, which is also known as an accommodation. So this would be for unilateral contracts, which are accepted by performance. If an item is delivered and there's notice given that is being offered as an accommodation, then perfect tender rule would not govern in that case because there has not been an acceptance. Instead, what has been is a counteroffer. So just be mindful of that small exception for the UCC perfect tender rule. Moving on to contracts involving goods and non-goods. So the rule for contracts involving goods and non-goods is if a sale involves both goods and non-goods, the court will be the one who will determine which one is dominant, and whichever one is dominant, the court will apply that governing law to the whole contract. However, if the contract itself divides payment between goods and non-goods, then the part of the contract governing goods will be governed under UCC, and the part of the contract governing non-goods will be governed under common law. But that is only when the contract itself divides payment between services and goods. Otherwise, if it's for something like buying a portrait of a painting, then the court would determine which one is more dominant and apply that law to the entire contract. Next, merchants versus non-merchants. So a number of UCC rules involve merchant versus non-merchant. So you'll notice a number of the rules in Article 2 actually pay attention to merchant versus non-merchant. So if you're seeing a lot of merchant versus non-merchant, a lot of UCC governs those rules. So if it's, sometimes you'll see a multiple choice question or an essay that discusses merchant versus non-merchant, but just try to remember that a lot of the UCC rules are what's governing that. So if it's common law, it may be a quick raise or dismiss, or it may not even apply. So we can see that in Article 2, depending on whether the seller or buyer is a merchant or non-merchant, Article 2 generally defines a merchant as one who regularly deals in goods of that kind, or otherwise holds themselves out as having knowledge, skill, peculiar to the goods involved. So you can reference UCC Section 2-104, Section 1. For many of the UCC provisions dealing with general business practices, such as statute of frauds, confirmatory memos, firm offers, modification, almost anyone in the business can be deemed a merchant because they have knowledge of the business practices. However, a few Article 2 provisions are narrower and require a person to be a merchant with respect to goods of the kind being sold. To be subject to any of the merchant rules, merchant must be acting in his mercantile capacity. So an example of this would be a person who is selling baseball cards as a hobby. So if it's their hobby, they're not acting in their mercantile capacity. So that matters for UCC for something like a merchant's firm offer. If that person were to make a firm offer, merchant's firm offer would not apply to that person because he's not acting in a mercantile capacity. He's dealing in cards as a hobby, not as a profession. On the other hand, somebody who sells computers and is a merchant, they have their own computer business, and they're buying from another business coffee for their business, they would be acting in a mercantile capacity because they're buying that coffee for business purposes, not for a personal purpose. But thank you so much again for coming to this contracts review. I hope this helps, and I hope you have a great day.